Hi, and welcome to the latest installment of the Psych Health and Safety Podcast live panel events. My name is Jason Banshee, and I'm one of the hosts of the regular podcast. As she is everyone's favourite, I'm really sorry to announce that Joelle will not be joining in the conversation today. However, for those attending live, you'll be able to interact with her in the chat via the YouTube comments section. The topic for today is improving workplace mental health in the construction industry by improving work, and will feature 3 subject matter experts with significant experience in the industry. So let's introduce the first of these panelists. Amanda Clements is the Executive Manager for Health, Safety, Environment and Quality at ProBuild, a leading Australian-based company in design, construction and project management. How are you today, Amanda?
Hi, Jason. Hi, everybody. Great to be here.
Yeah, really great to have you on. I've got to ask Amanda, because we've been talking a bit about this panel and what we want to get out of it. And I know you're a really big advocate for mental health in the construction industry. So what in particular do you want to get out of the discussion that we're having today?
I would have to say the main thing would be I'm very passionate about influencing change at a large scale upstream perspective, I guess. So more at the industry level, definitely the organisational level. And I know Michelle and her team and Helen have done some fantastic work. So especially in different industries, different types of research. So I'm really looking forward to what they have to share and seeing where we can take the conversation.
Yeah, and upstream is key, right? Because a lot of the interventions in construction and other industries as well are very much focused on the downstream. So how do we recognize when people are ill, and how do we respond? How do we get them access to help? But we know that prevention's better than cure, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, we talk about this from a physical safety sense as well. So I don't think it's a foreign concept, but I mean, one way that I like to put it is, and Michelle and Helen have actually referenced this in some of their research, is the me, we, and us kind of levels. And so quite often, we focus on the me, which is the individual, but the us level, which is the organisation or the industry. If you're coming at it from maybe a systems thinking perspective, that kind of concept and talking about the us level can be really helpful for people to just try and understand, okay, we need to think about this a little bit differently. And there's certainly some amazing conversations going on in the building and construction sector around that with different working groups. So I think it's definitely going to evolve.
So and hopefully this discussion kind of gives a bit of nuance or a bit of an insight into some of the discussions that you're having, at least at a construction industry level, and the work that Helen and Michelle are doing that feeds into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So speaking of Helen and Michelle, we should probably introduce them in.
Bring them in.
So they're both from RMIT University. So Helen Lingard is a distinguished professor, and Michelle Turner is an associate professor at RMIT University. So glad to have you both today.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
And thanks to Amanda for making the introductions to the both of you. I've really enjoyed some of the conversations that we've had leading up to this panel, and I'm sure the listeners today are going to get a lot out of it. Just in terms of that, listeners, what we'll be doing today is talking kind of like a fireside chat, hopefully nice and interactive and conversational for you, so it's engaging, for about 60 minutes, and then we're going to open up for 20 to 30 minutes at the end for live Q&A. If you want to participate in the live Q&A, then please make sure that you jot down any questions that you might have in the live chat feed for YouTube. And we'll try and include as many of those questions as possible in the last 20 to 30 minutes. So over to you, Michelle and Helen. I'm not sure who wants to answer this question, but obviously mental health in the construction industry is a key focus area of your research. Can you tell us a bit about what you've been doing in that space?
Michelle, shall I start?
Yeah, please, Helen.
Sure. So my interest in this area goes way back to 1999 when I was talking to a senior manager in the construction industry in a tier 1 construction company here in Australia. And he posed the question, why do my workers look so burnt out when I walk through the office? And I said, well, look, we're not sure, but we can, do a bit of research and try and look into that. And indeed, we did a survey. We got a very, very high response rate, extraordinarily high, which I think speaks to the fact that, this is an issue. This is an issue people care about. They're passionate about it. we found that burnout was very, very high, emotional exhaustion particularly. Long work hours were a key factor playing into that, and the conflict that people were experiencing between work and family. And that really was the starting point, and we've worked on those areas for some time since. I have to say, it's fair to say that the industry probably hasn't changed sufficiently during that time. So I think there's an opportunity now to really look at that in a systemic way.
Great. Anything to add to that, Michelle? Michelle, we can't hear you.
Oh, thank you. I knew I was going to do it. I won't do it again, I promise you. As Helen mentioned, the construction workforce does experience occupational stress in different ways. And I know that Helen's going to talk about hours worked between folks who are in corporate office, workers on site, and those working in direct construction activity. So I might throw back to you, Helen, then I'll maybe move into work-family conflict.
Sure. So one of the things that we looked at was how much time people spend at work. And we found that people working in corporate offices work long hours, on average 49 a week. But people working on site, but mainly in the site office, work an average of 56 hours a week. And those in direct construction activity on site work 62 hours a week. Now, interestingly enough, the International Labour Organization more than 90 years ago established a weekly threshold of 48 hours, beyond which people's mental health will be impacted. And indeed, more recent Australian research has actually shown that tipping point for weekly work hours beyond which mental health is negatively impacted is actually lower than the ILO level. So what this tells us is people working in construction, particularly in project-based roles, are actually working longer than the evidence and the standards would suggest is good for their mental health.
Yeah, and Amanda, I guess you're at the coalface, right? You work in industry. So is that your experience?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, every company is different, but there is certainly similar reasons across the companies in our industry as to why that would be. And, certainly anyone will tell you in our industry that it's highly competitive, and the way that tendering processes are run, and, the external factors, just think about COVID and the impact on the economy, that all snowballs everything. So there's certainly some things in construction that are similar to other professions and industries, but also unique. And my experience is, you talk to a lot of people in different roles and levels of the organization, and they will often tell you that the competitive tendering process is a significant challenge for us to look at. And again, that's got to be looked at the industry level. And there actually is some work going on around that, particularly there's a construction culture task force that's been put together. That's mainly been driven from a government level, but there also needs to be change happen. We work, for example, with a lot of predominantly private entities. So, it needs to be looked at on multiple facets.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Definitely we're seeing at the moment, due to the financial pressures and trying to be competitive, there's a lot of builders that are going down, and so job security is a real issue as well, no doubt, in the industry. But Helen, maybe you could talk about some of the cohort experiences. I mean, is there a difference regarding some of the mental health impacts in the construction industry by gender or any other kind of division?
Yeah, look, I'll comment on that issue around gender, and then throw to Michelle, because she's done a lot of work on gender that's really, really fabulous. She'll be able to share with you. The Australian research that looks at weekly hours and tipping points beyond which mental health is negatively impacted did find that effect was highly gendered. And so the number of hours that the average male can work before they're negatively impacted was actually 47, but the number of hours that women could work was 34. This is work that was conducted at the Australian National University, so it wasn't done by our team. It's not specific to construction. But the difference is that women still bear the greatest responsibility for domestic domestic work and caring responsibilities in households. And so that difference is explained by that gendered division of labour. But what that means is that in industries where there is a strong adherence to long work hours cultures, that women are actually going to be disadvantaged. It's going to be a disincentive for women, an impediment for women, and in some senses works as an indirect form of discrimination. So that's why it's important, and that's an important impact that I think we're seeing. And we do know that construction in Australia is one of the industries that has the worst performance in terms of gender diversity. But Michelle, you've done a lot of work on this area as well.
Thanks. Yes, that's right. In addition to that comment around tipping points for women being lower than men, we know that women also experience additional challenges which can impact on their mental health. We know that discrimination, sexual harassment, bullying, and belonging to a minority status are all associated with lower levels of mental health. And when we think about women at university and construction management courses, project management courses, and indeed apprentices. They start their careers in construction, from an educational level as a minority, and that continues throughout their career. We did some research last year on the wellbeing of women on site based in Victoria, and some of the women actually experienced some of those gendered hazards they experience, such as exclusion and isolation. And I thought it was worthwhile sharing a couple of quotes so you get a sense of some of the experience that they were having. One of the women in the study said, "My supervisor would come in the morning. He'd shake everyone's hand, but he wouldn't shake mine. So there's a real sense that you don't belong here, you're excluded, and that made those women feel isolated. And it's very much upfront. These women are told they don't belong. So another example is that a male worker told a female worker, "Women are for cooking and cleaning. They're not supposed to be on site. Get back into your own space." And we know that's harmful because exclusion and isolation are both associated with mental health, unfortunately. Our research also raised incidents of harassment. And again, we learnt that some women experience some very challenging things. And I'll give you an example. We learnt that one woman working on site had been locked in a portaloo for 2 hours during summer. It was really hot. She didn't have a phone, and the guys thought it would be funny. So incidents like this can cause really high levels of stress and also create longer term anxiety.
So it sounds like the two of you have, a focus on working hours in construction and the relation to mental health, and then the impacts on women as well. But from what you're talking about, those examples, it sounds like incivility and bullying and harassment even.
Absolutely. And that's one of the topics that I want to pick up a little bit later on when we talk about creating a positive mental health environment, why respect and civility are so important. So that's a great pickup, Jason.
Yeah. So what about then any comments on the state of mental health in the construction industry in Australia? Maybe over to you, Amanda. Is there any relevant research, given you're, obviously working at a high level of advocacy in the industry? Is there any relevant statistics you could point us to?
Yeah, look, I'm sure a lot of the listeners would be familiar with the statistics around suicide. And for those who aren't, construction industry has one of the highest rates of suicide of any profession. Some research points that it's at least double other professions. And certainly a lot of the statistics that I've seen around the general population, like some of the, cases of depression, are one particular research that I was involved in some time after, in terms of coming up with some solutions that Luke Downey did from RMIT, was pointed to 40% higher rates of depression than the average population. So it's not just suicide, it's a lot of illness. And what I've actually seen quoted quite often now, I think people trying to give some sort of context to what's going on, is that a person in the construction industry is 6 times more likely to take their life than to die in a workplace accident, if you compare it to physical safety risks and fatalities. So yeah, it's a really disturbing figures, and yeah, it's quite sad when you hear Michelle and Helen talk about, who've been involved in this industry and research for so long, that from their perspective, not much has changed. And I think I do personally kind of feel in the last couple of years there's been more focus. Certainly in Victoria, Workwell through WorkSafe have provided a lot of funding, and I was involved in some working groups around wellness in infrastructure, for example, and lots of other groups that are got together and wanted to do something about it. And like you said, Jason, so many people are really passionate. I just think that there's some very systemic, like I said, upstream challenges that this industry has that until they're, addressed by clients, by investors, by governments, that, we're not going to see that significant change to people's lives.
No, it is, as you say, like Helen and Michelle have shared, it is particularly alarming that nothing's really changed. And, the statistics are pretty bad, particularly around suicide. Is there anything else around the prevalence of mental ill health or psychological injuries, not necessarily suicides, that is maybe different in the construction industry compared to other industries in Australia?
Helen, would you like me to get started?
There's quite a few. You're teeing up.
We've already mentioned some of the challenges of working in construction, and one of those things was the long working hours, the issue of work family conflict, and the gendered hazards that women experience due to their minority status. Some other challenges that workers in construction experience is the transient nature of the workforce. It's very much project-based industry, which means that workers are often employed for specific periods of time, and they don't normally have ongoing employment prospects. And we know there's a strong evidence base that poor mental health is linked to job insecurity. I know that in one of our research projects, a construction worker told us that he wanted to get a loan and buy a car so he could drive his daughter to school. I mean, that's a fairly reasonable request, but the bank knocked him back because of his employment status, his lack of job security, and he didn't qualify for the loan. So these are a lot of the hidden impacts on working long hours, but certainly also the transient nature of the workforce. Helen, I'll throw over to you.
I'd just like to add to that young workers in the construction industry are particularly vulnerable, and that's documented in research, including a study that we're currently undertaking of construction apprentices. Indeed, adolescents and people in early adulthood are, generally speaking, at risk for mental illness. And I think estimates to say 75% of lifetime mental disorders actually start below the age of 24. So young workers are at risk. And a recent study that's been done again in Australia shows that young workers' mental health can be impaired by poor psychosocial job quality, characterized by low control, high demands, low security, and unfair pay. Now, those characteristics, particularly the high demands, low job security, low levels of control, those are the sorts of things which we hear young construction workers tell us are characteristic of their jobs. And certainly one of the things that doesn't help is some of the masculine work environment, and the fact that help seeking still has sort of a bit of a stigma attached to it as well. So young workers who might experience distress are often don't feel confident enough to seek help, which is why interventions and organisations like we see in Australia, we've got Mates in Construction and other programs that help to address some of those things, which is really very important. The other point I'd like to make about the construction workforce and things that might impact them, and again, I'll throw to Michelle because this is work that Michelle and I did together relatively recently, but Michelle led, is the fact that we know that there is a close relationship between bodily pain and physical injury and mental ill health. And musculoskeletal disorders and bodily pain and physical injuries are quite prevalent in construction workers, even at relatively young ages, particularly those in demanding physically based jobs. So I think that that notion of how the physical and the mental interact, and the mental health impacts of actually suffering an injury that might in fact prevent you from working and impact your livelihood is and participating in life activities is actually another characteristic of the construction industry that increases the risk.
Yeah, and I'd agree that's pretty unique to the industry. Obviously, it's still very much manual labor is a large part of the job. And as someone who's had 2 back operations, I can definitely attest personally to, the link between lower back pain and your mental well-being, right? One of the things though I wanted to ask as a follow-up, Helen, though, is the young worker piece that you're talking about, because I don't think that's necessarily construction specific. I mean, in our last panel that Desi Vlahos moderated, she was talking about young people in the legal profession and graduates and how they were more likely to be burnt out and leave the legal profession early. We see the same in education as well. Early career teachers generally are more risk of burnout compared to people who've been in there for longer. So that's not necessarily unique to the construction industry.
Jason, can I
Yeah.
jump in and perhaps just add a comment there? It may not be unique, but some of the research, certainly that Helen's done, it emerged that these young apprentices are sometimes 16, 17, and then they're in a stage of transition from school to work, adolescence to adulthood. So it's a challenging time anyway. But often they enter the workforce, and you might have heard the rituals and the hazing in construction that sometimes happen. That's certainly something that we've heard that some of the apprentices do experience. So, for example, it's common practice to initiate an apprentice into the job by having them perform some menial or degrading activity, and by them not complaining and laughing, it offers a joke. The apprentice is accepted into the group, having passed the initiation. However, we know that those rituals can lead to psychological harm. And Amanda, I
Yeah,
don't
and I
know if
want
you
I
see
wanted
this on
Yeah,
your
I wanted to, I
sides.
wanted I wanted to ask, what was unique about the young people in the construction industry, and definitely the age that they're starting. Like you say, they're generally starting younger, whereas professional lawyers, teachers, they're a bit older because they have to do an undergraduate degree at least. And then the hazing, right, is not as prevalent in, say, legal profession or teaching as compared to, say, the construction industry. But Amanda, is that something that you've noticed yourself?
Yeah, look, I've certainly heard some of those horror stories as well. I must admit, since I've been more in the building sector of construction, I haven't seen that too much, or I haven't heard any specific stories that come to mind. But I think like Michelle was just saying, some of those more meaningless tasks, or especially when you're doing laboring and things like that, I can see certainly how it's easy for younger, not necessarily even younger people that are just new into the industry, starting from the ground up. It's almost like you've got to sort of the hierarchy and work your way up and things like that. So yeah, I can definitely see that could be a real challenge.
Jason, could I raise perhaps another characteristic of the construction industry that can be harmful? The industry is known for its high conflict and at times adversarial work environment. And, that's felt within some of our research participants. I was talking to one of our construction management graduates, and he told us that he was told by his supervisor that he was being too nice when he was speaking on the phone to subcontractors, and he was told to be more aggressive. And it was really distressing for him. He decided to leave the organisation, and it made him question whether he actually wanted to stay in construction industry.
And could I just add as well to this question about what makes the construction industry a little bit different? And I think it does come back to the culture. And again, our apprenticeship study that we're currently undertaking has looked very much at the masculine culture of communication and humour on site. And there's a lot of site banter, and there's a lot of joking, and that's a feature of the industry. And that's actually a really good thing, because banter can be very positive. It can be build social coherence. It can alleviate boredom. It can make people feel, that they belong, and so on. And that's okay if it's affiliative humor. But if it's aggressive humor, where it victimizes, ridicules, or belittles people, then it's actually psychologically harmful. And again, this is not just unique to construction, but what we observe in construction is that banter is so endemic and so entrenched and so part of the culture that it's almost amplified in its impact, I think. Just as an example, some of the banter in our study was also found to be quite sexual in nature. And again, what's funny to one person may not be funny to someone else, and it's a fine line, and these judgment calls are made, and sometimes lines are crossed, and that can be harmful. So we actually found a study, an example where we found two young apprentices both going into the same workplace, one male and one female, and the male apprentice was a bit worried about the female apprentice in the workplace and wasn't sure how that would go down. They were worried about the joking and how it would impact the banter, and quite concerned that it would inhibit the fun that was being had. But this young woman described her situation, and she, just by way of illustrating this, I'll give you a quote. She said, look, if you don't have a sense of humor with the boys in this industry, you won't get along with them. It's about females, sexual jokes and all of that. They like to hurt you, they like to rattle you, but then at the same time, you've got to say, well, yeah, I'm going to hear this for the rest of my life because I'm female. So there's an acceptance of it. But she then went on to say, but like saying, you stupid bitch, or calling me the C word, it's nothing too bad. It's not to the point like where it's discriminative or anything. That they were her exact words. And I guess the thing that shocked us about that particular comment is it just shows how normalized that behavior is. And something that would be entirely inappropriate in another workplace setting is normalized and accepted within a construction site environment. So I think that, again, says something about the culture of the industry. Not everywhere. I'm sure not all workplaces would have that culture, but certainly in pockets of the industry, that culture still prevailed.
Yeah, interesting what you say regarding the aggression as well. I find that I think everyone understands the Aussie larrikin, the banter that happens in many workplaces, but maybe mainly or maybe the best cases are in construction, or the worst cases, however you look at it. But the aggression, I've got a business partner who helps out in our business, but also has a role in a construction business. And the way he has to talk on the phone, or he feels he needs to talk on the phone when trying to manage subcontractors, is completely different to how he would operate in a professional business. So there's a lot more F-bombs. He feels like he needs to get angry to actually get things moving. And it seems that is a large part of the culture.
Jason, I was actually going to mention about that subcontractor hierarchy, and it's certainly something that I see a lot. And, I think there's like a big piece around the culture that's got to change around that too. And where I have actually seen it work really well, and there's certainly, a lot of amazing managers that I deal with on a daily basis that are trying to really drive change in this area, is around that more relationship-driven sort of, or I guess what a lot in the research it's called, and what some companies call collaborative contracting. And, there's a lot of evidence to show that you don't need, the really top-down hard approach. Actually involving the subcontractors in, how work's designed, or, getting their view and their opinion. It not only helps from a psychological perspective, but it certainly helps from the performance of the project. So I would love to see more around the different contracting models. And, again, I know a lot of companies are trying different things in that space, but it would be great to share and hear more about that.
And I guess that you could say is fairly unique to the construction industry as well, right? There's such a reliance on subcontractor relationships and the supply chain. You work so closely together, right? So it makes sense that you're including subcontractors in those conversations about how work can be designed to, improve mental health outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm sure that there's not many companies that would say that they don't, consult or include subcontractors, for example, especially big tier 1 companies like I'm in. But I think it's a lot of that sort of day-to-day conversation that Michelle was just mentioning, about how people are, perhaps slightly looked down upon, and then that sort of filters out into other dealings that may be had between principal contractors and subcontractors. And then new people come into the business and they just see how those conversations are had, and, think that that's normal. So, plenty of work to be done in that space.
Yeah, one of the questions, sorry, Helen, sorry, Michelle. One of the questions that has come up from the YouTube chat was, what about the culture of drugs and alcohol in construction, and the impact that might have on worker mental health? Because that's something that we haven't touched on yet. Is there anything in your research that kind of could shed a light on this?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Helen, if you like. We did do some research up in Queensland. It was around a power station that ended up closing, and we were there to research health promotion and prevention. But unfortunately, at that time, the employees were told that they no longer have a job because the organisation didn't win the tender to continue the job. And the issue of alcohol and drugs did come up, but it came up as a coping strategy to deal with stress. I recall one of the team members telling me at a focus group at that research that she had, I think it was Wednesday, and she had been she explained it, driving home, opening the front door, going to the fridge, opening the fridge door and getting her first drink. And that was a way around coping. But I think that's a symptom of stress. So we haven't, Helen, you can jump in. We haven't directly measured alcohol and drugs, but we know that often that's one way of these folks to cope with the high levels of stress.
I think that's borne out by our colleague Paul Bowen's work as well, isn't it? His work is undertaken in the construction industry in South Africa, but he's also documented the use of drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism for work-related stress.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of time. We've been having a great chat, and I need to make sure that we stay on track with our agenda to get through in an hour. One of the things I did want to talk about with you, Helen and Michelle, while we've got you both here, is your research publication called Sense of Place. Could you maybe, Helen, give us a brief summary of what that research project focused on?
I'm on mute. Sure, I can. So I guess there are two ways of looking at mental health in the workplace. One is the need to identify, eliminate, and reduce workplace risk factors, psychosocial risk factors, and that's obviously something which has become very front of mind, with changes to laws and standards and so on. So I think that's a good thing, and it's very, very important that we do that. It's very important that we look at dealing with organizational and job design issues, not just the lower, focusing on the individual. I think we need to look upstream, like Amanda says. So that's one important aspect. But the other important aspect is actually trying to find opportunities to create workplaces that have the characteristics in which people can thrive. And those workplaces include, places where people are treated with respect, as Amanda quite rightly pointed out, the way that, subcontractors are treated, and the way that they're engaged and consulted, and the way that, decisions that impact them are made. All of those things are actually really good things that can actually help to create a work environment or a project environment where people can actually be healthy. And I think that's be mentally healthy. And so that's where we were coming from, Michelle, when we actually developed the Sense of Place model, which is currently being tested and trialed in construction projects in New Zealand. And Michelle, do you want to talk about the actual content of the model?
Yeah, sure. So just very quickly, we did a lit review and we took a positive psychology approach to flourishing in the workplace. As Helen said, it's important to remove or reduce hazards. It's also important to enable an environment at work that people can flourish. So the 6 conditions we identified in the literature that were related to positive mental health were a sense of community, being engaged with your team, with your organisation, as has been raised a few times now, that really important component of culture is respect and civility, life balance. We've talked a little bit about work-life balance, having time for work, but also having quality of time to enjoy those things outside of work. Social support, and that's come up a few times as well, and also resilience. So we are proposing that those 6 elements, they interact to create a sense of place, and that sense of place then supports positive mental health.
Yeah, no, I'm a fan of the positive psychology literature, and what you've come up with your 6 factors is fairly similar, or can be mapped almost onto the PERMA model from Martin Seligman. So it's quite interesting how you've kind of come out with the same factors specific for the construction industry as is broader, I guess, in that model. Is there anything, because you've developed a measure as well of these 6 factors, is that right?
We did develop a metric for measuring sense of place. We've just finished collecting data from an organisation in New Zealand. The organisation took a $100 million plant upgrade and building maintenance project. And we're in the process now of analysing the data to see how the 6 conditions or elements are related to a sense of place and how they might contribute to mental health. And I've started to go through the comments. A lot of folks have added comments to their surveys, and some really promising comments. One person talked about being able to work in a safe and fun work environment, and it's given her the confidence to continue working in the construction industry. But we'll look forward to sharing those results when they're ready to go.
Is it too early to tell, like, what of the 6 factors may be most important in leading to mental health outcomes?
Yeah, it's a little bit too early. We're in the process of just entering the data now, and then we'll need to run some stats on it. But that should be done within a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I know definitely in our own research using the PERMA model, we found that sense of purpose and meaning in life seemed to be the most important predictor of mental health outcomes, and kind of is aligned to Simon Sinek's stuff like start with why. There's actually a lot of sense for why you would do that.
That's right. And I must say that we did look at Seligman's work when we were doing some reading around sense of place and positive psychology. Some really
Yeah,
good stuff
you'd
there.
have to. He is the godfather of positive
He
psychology,
is.
after
He
all.
is. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Helen, did you have something else to add to that?
Just to say that the sense of place is so important because the construction industry works in projects. So it's really, really hard for people to develop a sense of belonging and a sense of place and a sense of connection with their work environment and their co-workers and their organizations when people are in temporary project organizations, and there's lots of subcontractors and people come and go during the life of a project. So you don't have the stability that you have in other industry sectors, which is why I think from our perspective, this sense of place is actually really important.
Yeah, is there any particular things, maybe not out of the tool that you've developed, but in your broader research, is there any particular strategies that would help foster a sense of place for construction workers?
Well, some of the components. Oh, sorry, Michelle. Do you want to...
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing, Helen. So over to you.
Well, I'll let you chip in after I've had a say. So some of the components, like one of the components is around social support, and social support is really, really important. And our research, in fact, shows that. So for many years, we've looked at various types of social support from supervisors, from co-workers, from others, and we found that it provides a very important buffering impact. So when people are experiencing stress, if they're in a supportive work environment, it's much less likely to manifest in burnout, for example. And that's a demonstrated relationship. So that notion of social support is really important. However, the work that we did on social support also showed that it's not enough just to provide emotional support, to listen to people and to be a sympathetic ear. The support has to be practical. So you actually have to intervene to do things that make people's lives easier, to alleviate the stressors that they're exposed to. So I think that notion of practical support and how to help people by reducing the stress factors that they're experiencing is really critical. And that's certainly, again, borne out by our research.
Yeah, and I think I'll just pick up on this issue that was raised by Amanda around culture and a change of culture. And maybe workplace civility and respect is one of the really important changes that needs to be made, because they're around norms for mutual respect at work, which are associated with positive connecting with others and also building relationships. So maybe that's something that actually might emerge as a particularly important enabler of folks to flourish at work.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we currently have a piece of research where we're running a randomized controlled trial in the construction industry to try and create more effective and supportive communication between construction supervisors and apprentices. So really targeting on those high-risk apprentices, but looking at how can we get supervisors and apprentices both to communicate more effectively together to support health, well-being, and also safety.
Yeah, terrific. Now, you could say the sense of place stuff because it's, I guess, grounded more around promoting the positive from the, it's the positive psychology literature. If we think about the integrated model, and we had Professor Tony LaMontagne on our podcast recently talk to the model, which is fantastic. And in fact, if anyone hasn't registered yet, the AIHS are running their integrated mental health conference over the next couple of days as well. And we'll be talking more broadly about those concepts. But yours is really much about promoting the positive, right? How do we get people to flourish? But what is getting increasing attention, as has already been flagged, I think by you, Helen, earlier, is this idea around preventing harm, particularly given the fact that it looks likely that we're going to have some new regulations regarding psychological injury, psychological health and safety coming out early to mid next year in Australia. So, Amanda, over to you, because you've been quiet there, sitting there waiting for your turn for a bit. You come from the health and safety profession, and I know that this is a particular interest of you. Do you think, and I think I saw this actually come up as a question before as well, what do you feel are the main psychosocial hazards in the workplace? And maybe just for listeners who aren't aware of the term psychosocial hazards, basically we're talking about anything in the design or management of work that contributes to work-related stress. And it's really that ongoing or very high levels of stress that we're concerned about, because they're the ones that are most likely to lead to a psychological injury. So in construction, Amanda, what do you feel are probably the biggest ones that need to be contended with? We've talked about incivility as maybe one of them, but would you agree that's the main one, or would there be some other ones that we need to be cognizant of?
I guess, well, personally, I see a couple that we've already named around the transient nature of the industry and contractors and things like that. A couple of others that are absolutely the number one for me is the job pressure and demands. And we've talked a little bit about, I guess, the hours worked. There's some research going on about looking at different how many days a week we work and different things like that. What really struck me, I don't know, it's probably about a year ago, I was talking to someone in the industry, and she said to me that when I asked her what was one of the biggest challenges it was not a conversation about psychological health at all, but just generally around, I was doing some work discovery, and the first thing she said to me was, I could tell how anxious and stressed she was. And she said, Amanda, I don't even have time to have lunch or go to the toilet. And I could tell that she was, visibly upset by that. And I mean, I'm sure people could say, well, we'll just say you need to go to the toilet. But when you're so passionate and focused on what you're doing and you don't want to let the team down, and that's the culture around you, like meeting to meeting to meeting from God, people start at 6 and get home at 7, and don't see their families. And this person had a family. It was really distressing to hear. And interestingly enough, because I saw this question come up before, and I quite often get this question, nearly every session I do like this around some topic, that this question comes up about how to get buy-in from senior leadership. And I actually shared that story with our senior leaders, and I didn't put stats and figures and data in their face. For one, there's not a huge amount of, metrics and data that we capture on site health and safety. But what's really important, and we know that this drives change, is actually sharing personal stories and I guess tapping into that emotional side of people. And that's certainly one that I've shared around job pressure and demands. And I think, whilst not to take away at all from people's mental illness and things that they're suffering, there is a lot more conversation around that, whether it's suicide or mental health prevention. But it actually, really quite often, almost on a daily basis, occurs to me that there's so many people like that woman that are just struggling day by day, just trying to get by. And I just think, what kind of a life is that really? And you've come to work to do something you love, to contribute to the community, and you're just exhausted at the end of the day and not nourishing yourself. All of those things, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, not taking lunch, but there's just those kind of stories that you hear, and it's quite shocking. So I would definitely say job pressure and demands, which again is linked to that, highly competitive nature of the industry and how we resource projects and, things like that. So that would be one of them. Another one that I just wanted to bring people's attention to, which I'm super passionate about and have spoken about this on a few occasions, is how we basically lead and enable change in workplaces. And quite often it still is, again, there's, Helen and Michelle said this, we've been research around for years and years and years and years around different areas of like this, and same with change. So for at least 30 years we've known that sort of top-down hierarchical approach is, one, not very good for the performance of the organization, but two, it actually has a very detrimental effect to people in the organization who want to have some kind of say over what they're doing and want to contribute and want to be part of that group. So and for those who don't know, change is one of the 14 psychosocial hazards. And it's no excuse because there's amazing tools which can basically, you can use to really engage with people and, get them involved in being part of the solution. So, that would be my top two.
Yeah. Now, given that we know that men are less likely to seek help than women, I mean, I saw some telephone helpline statistics recently, and women were twice as likely to call into that helpline than men were. Yet we know that men are 2 times more likely to die by suicide than women. So we know the mental health issues are very similar in terms of frequency or prevalence from males to females, but males are less likely to access support. So it makes a lot of sense, don't you think, Amanda, that, rather than beating the drum and trying unsuccessfully again and again and again to try and change behavior around self-care, that maybe we try and fix the work. I mean, and then that way we, if we work upstream, we're much more likely to have a better impact on men's mental health moving forward.
I've thought about this a lot as well, because I have this kind of internal tension around, I've practiced yoga and meditation for over 15 years and have a lot of amazing friends who research mindfulness and things like that. So I really firmly believe it's not an or kind of conversation. I think there's some amazing wellbeing practices and things that people can do on an individual level that companies can promote. But absolutely, the more emphasis needs to be given to the organizational factors, definitely.
Yeah, and look, I don't argue with it all. I mean, the evidence is very clear about things like mindfulness meditation and the benefits it can have around reducing the effects of stress and whatnot. But getting men in particular to engage in these things, particularly in the cultures that we're talking about in the construction industry, can be particularly difficult. And it's not to take away from some great organizations like Mates in Construction have already been mentioned, Are You OK, Beyond Blue, Black Dog, organizations doing a really great thing, trying to increase the understanding around mental illness and increasing people's appetite for self-care. It still doesn't seem to have the impact, right? Because the statistics aren't getting any better.
I have to say, just from my own personal experience, even encouraging, I worked with road workers, for quite a long time. And yes, we got them to do some, wellbeing activities, but by far and wide, the biggest impact that I saw, and just how much that they, lit up about being able to be involved and have a say, was, when coming back to the piece about change, is, they were invited into a process called learning teams, and for some of them it was the first time that they truly had an opportunity to contribute to improving their work and felt like they were seen and heard. So to be honest, my suggestion to a lot of people would be, focus on things like that, that, we do have an ability to control, rather than, I guess, trying to push stuff down people's throat around different wellbeing practices.
Yeah, and I fully agree. Like, it's a shared responsibility for mental health in the workplace, and we need to be giving people, some guidance and support, and going, well, these are some activities that you might want to access, but knowing that men aren't going to access it doesn't then mean we go, well, we tried, and then that's it. Like you say, there are lots of opportunities where we start looking at psychosocial factors in the workplace, whether that's change consultation, whether it's leadership practices, whether it's workload, hours worked, that sort of thing, and look at how we improve the work. And I guess that's where the title of today's panel comes about, knowing that self-care is very difficult to drive in the construction industry. Well, we know we can have a great impact if we improve things upstream, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I would love to hear, I mean, we've spoken a little bit now about job demands and competitive tendering and change, but yeah, I'm curious from maybe Helen, for you, from the research you've seen, what, there's 14 common psychosocial hazards. There are a couple of them, but from your research, sorry, Jason, I'm taking over the interviewing.
Right, it's a fireside chat.
Doing you out of a job, sorry. I'm super curious to hear from Helen, from your research. What are you seeing in construction, the common psychosocial hazards?
Look, it's fair to say we haven't done a study of all of the psychosocial hazards and looked at which ones are the most prevalent, which ones are the most harmful. However, we have looked at the HILDA dataset, the Household Income Labour Dynamics in Australia dataset, which is a very large longitudinal cohort study. And within that dataset, we isolated the construction workforce and looked at the things that had the biggest impact on mental health over a period of time. So we looked at sort of a 10-year window. And we found that the things that came up were job demands in many forms. And I think you made a really important point about work hours and work time. And you said it's not just about the number of hours you work, it's about the intensity that you work. And I'd add to that, because there are three things in the work time literature that sort of talks to help mental health that can be damaging, can be impactful. And I think they all apply to project-based construction work. One is time, i.e. the number of hours you work. One is tempo, i.e. how intensely you have to work, and that talks to the experience of the woman you described. And one is timing, which is the compatibility of your working time with other things that are going in your life. So whether you can take your children to sport, or whether you can go to your child's school concert, or whatever it might be. Not all about parents, obviously there are other things as well, but that time, tempo and timing of work are all different forms of time-related demands that impact negatively on construction workers. The other biggie that came up was job security and a lack of control. So the things which we often talk about, we know they're well documented, but in our analysis of the HILDA data set, they all came out as being the things that had the most adverse impacts on construction workers' mental health.
Michelle, you look like you want to jump in there as well.
No, I'm agreeing with everything that Helen's saying. I think, so many things emerge from long working hours and hours. So if we can do something with working hours, I think there'll be some downstream impacts on people's health and well-being. And
just to add to that as well, I mean, one of the things around that work intensity that we did, again, it goes back probably more than 10 years now, but we actually, in a number of large projects, measured people's experiences on a weekly basis, and we collected data every week for a long period of time in these projects. And we found what we documented and described as the rhythms of project life actually had a real impact. So when the project was, going along in its normal patterns, it was fine. But at the points at which in this project there were major milestones to be delivered, people's working time practices went through the roof, and people were coming in at 4 a.m. and actually saying, look, I came in at 4 a.m. just to get my job done, and I've gone home at the end of the day and I still didn't finish everything I needed to finish. Now, that's not sustainable at all. And so one of the things that came out of that study was we also were able to sort of suggest that if you give people time to recover between work shifts, then they're much better, that they can recover adequately from the efforts, both psychological and physical, that they expend at work, and they travel a lot better in terms of their mental health and well-being. So again, it begs the question, when we're looking at construction project schedules, is there a way to actually, program in schedule recovery opportunities? Because we know that at certain points in the life of a project, the natural rhythms of that project will put people under quite a lot of pressure. So knowing that can we plan for that to make sure that those peaks are not quite so extreme, and then also people are given the opportunity to recover when they've gone through those periods.
So it sounds to me, Helen, like you're talking about a foreseeable risk, right? We know that this is going to happen at certain times. So really we should be managing those risks because they are foreseeable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Jason, just a quick thing to add to that, because again, this talks to about how do you get buy-in, or, I think some person mentioned about, being shameful and embarrassing to talk about. I really think there's an amazing opportunity to talk about psychological health more as from a human performance perspective. And I've done a fair bit of work around flow and creating optimal performance, just from my own interest, but also from creating really high performing teams. And so, I think if you do a little bit of research around that and look at like what Helen just talked about, is to actually perform at your best, you need every day, you need active recovery. And you think about like a lot of the project teams that I deal with every day, constantly, online and answering emails at all hours and submitting bids late at night, and all, this kind of 24/7 hyper connectivity. I think all of that adds up to, over time, people just get burnt out, and then, a lot of people leave the industry, and that's kind of the sad truth.
Yeah, we had Dr. Catherine Page on our podcast just recently. If anyone hasn't listened to it yet, it's a fantastic episode. And she talks about this kick the cat phenomenon. When you leave work and you got all those frustrations built up by the stresses and whatnot, you walk in the door and the first thing you see gets it, whether it's the kids, your partner, or the cat. And she talked about this recovery period, right? We need this third space somewhere between work and home, so we can create that disconnect between the two, and that work doesn't flow into that. And really talked about the frequency of that behavior, right? Doing it as a daily habit, rather than going, and we've seen it recently, the companies giving people a week off to deal with burnout. And we don't really believe that's sustainable, right? You can't give people a week off every month. But finding those periods of recovery in your daily schedule or routine is really important for construction workers, you'd have to think.
Yeah, so I mean, that would be one suggestion for the audience, is to maybe think about how we can talk about this topic in a more maybe a more holistic way, rather than just, mental illness individual, to actually how we can drive high performing organizations, because that's certainly what will get the attention of senior leaders as well.
Yeah. Are there any other controls? We've spoken a bit about working hours. Is there anything that's happening at an industry level around working hours, if that's one of the known psychosocial risk factors? Amanda, are you aware of anything that's happening in the space?
Yeah, I can definitely comment. So yes, there is some pretty high profile research that I believe has just been or about to be published more broadly, which is a 5-day week. Quite an extensive piece of research that's been going on. I'm really interested and excited to see that research, whilst also being very mindful that, well, I guess one to be completely honest, one fear I have about that is that, people quite often take a concept that they've heard and go, oh, that sounds like a great idea, let's do that. But what we know is, just changing the days that you're working could actually, if you don't have all the other building blocks in place, like particularly around looking at people's job and how much they need to do in that, even if it's 5 days instead of 6, it could actually compound the issue. So I'm really interested to see what that looks like. And even within our company, we're talking about experimenting and researching different options as well. So I don't know, Michelle or Helen, have you come across any other pieces around that?
Helen, perhaps you wanted to talk about your research a few years ago around the 5-day work week.
Yes.
It's interesting on this 5-day work week though, right? Because there's a lot of companies experimenting with 4-day work weeks, right? And all of a sudden 5 days in the construction industry seems to be, quite a phenomenon.
Well, 5 days is radical for construction, and that says something when other industries are, as you say, experimenting with 4 days. Interestingly enough, there is this piece of work that's just about to be launched in the not too distant future, and that's really interesting. And that's wrapped up with this construction industry culture task force, which is seeking to try to address some of the challenges of the construction industry's culture around working time practice, gender diversity, and health, but mental health and well-being is a big focus. And interestingly enough, there is this notion that the 5-day week may in fact be a better model. But again, the evidence needs to be collected, and we need to really understand it in all its complexities. I absolutely agree with Amanda. And in fact, next year there will be some other, I believe that there'll be some other case study projects which try different working time arrangements. Going back to the work Michelle alluded to, we've actually looked at different models of a 5-day week in the Queensland construction industry in the mid 2000s, 2005, 2006, where we looked at 4 different projects. And we found that there were real challenges associated with reducing working time in the construction industry, because if you actually reduce hours, which according to the international research is actually what's needed to address the issues around psychological risk associated with really long work hours. If you reduce those hours, there are different stakeholders in the life of a construction project who have very different interests, and one of the things that we often see is where work hours actually are compressed rather than reduced. So maybe people work longer hours over 5 days, so they basically don't work a 6th day, but for the 5 days they work more hours each day, which again, I think the consequences of all of these things and the best models that can be adopted by the industry still need quite a bit of research to really understand all the different stakeholder interests and impacts and who benefits and where the challenges might be and how it will all work. So I look forward to this new body of research. We're very interested to see the report that's soon to come out, but also recognizing that there's probably more work needs to be done.
Yeah, I can imagine if it was overly prescriptive, you may not work any more than 5 days, then that would actually cause more issues as well, right? Because you're actually taking away a sense of control and people feeling like you say they need to work longer hours on their 5 days to make up for the fact that they can't work over the weekend, for instance.
Yeah, and of course there are sectors of the industry, the rail sector, for example, where working 7 days is required because a lot of railways need to be shut down for certain construction activities. So there are challenges across the sector. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution by any stretch.
Yeah, well, you have to give us a link to the literature, Helen, when it comes out, and we'll add it to the episode notes for the podcast episode that we release.
Can I just make one point on that, Jason? And I think it's also worth noting too that we're not the construction workforce is not one group. It's a diverse group, and we know we've got salaried and wage folks, and we know salaried folks work their hours, and above those paid hours they don't get paid usually, whereas wage folks get paid a standard wage, and then they get paid for overtime. So in our research we hear that in fact usually those manual workers like to work long hours, and I think again that comes back to one of the symptoms of perhaps they don't know when the next job's going to be, so they say to us, you make hay while the sun shines. So there is some complexity around working hours, and I think Helen's right in saying it's not really around days, it's around hours worked, and that's what will impact on health and well-being.
Yeah, so I reckon watch this space. It seems like it's well known, obviously, that this is one of the big issues, and it'll be interesting to see what the research kind of generates as what are practical things that companies could do to address that risk factor. I am conscious of time, and we do have some great questions from the audience I'd love to turn over to now, unless anyone's got some final remarks before we move to Q&A. Nope. Okay. So how about we start with this question here? Can you provide any examples of where you have worked with a construction business but found that senior management has been reluctant to act on psych health and safety? And how then did you create buy-in from those leaders? So first of all, psych health and safety, psychosocial risk management is kind of a fairly new, I guess, across all industries, let alone the construction industry. So first of all, have you found any leaders reluctant to act on psych health and safety?
I could probably talk to that. So I think that I genuinely feel, and from what I've observed and talking to probably hundreds of leaders over the last 10 years on this topic, that the reluctance, again, it doesn't come from just genuinely not caring. I think the one very, very common answer that I get from leaders is that, well, we just won't, if we're not competitive, we just won't win a job. And then, well, no one's got a job. And you come full circle, because one of the key parts of well-being is having a purpose and having a job, and having that job security, like we mentioned before. So it's a very complicated issue, and that's why I really feel that those conversations need to be had with leaders, but they also need to be had with clients and governments and investors as well. So I know that doesn't really help in terms of practical advice, but I would, anyone who's interested in this topic, I would encourage you to go that next level up and get involved in working groups and lobby regulators. And I won't say too much about that, but I would love to see more, focus there around holding companies accountable and, driving change. But I think, the more people that are talking about these issues and, like I said, focusing upstream, I think the more change we'll see that will positively impact companies downstream.
Yeah, like you, Amanda, I don't see it as a lack of caring. I'd say it's probably more ignorance of the approach, the psych health and safety approach, more than anything else. So there is a lot of education and, definitely industry associations and advocacy groups would be a great way to get that in front of employers. Well, we're really getting hit up with a lot of questions, actually, so we can't spend too much time on each of them. I think you answered that really well, Amanda. So how about this one here? So given it's predominantly a male industry, how is mental health and psychological health and safety communicated in a way that is welcomed, not something seen as shameful or embarrassing? Helen or Michelle, you'd probably be a good one to answer that, given your research.
I can jump in and give it a go, and Helen, you can jump in after me if you like. This has been raised by a lot of our research participants, and when we interview these workers one-on-one, they tend to be a little bit more open with us. They describe the masculine macho construction workforce. We've all got tattoos and we all pretend to be tough, but we know if we raise mental health as an issue, it'd be really stigmatized. We'd feel awkward. We'd be seen as weak. So I get that. That's tough. Why would you make yourself vulnerable like that? So I think perhaps it's about normalizing the conversations, like Amanda said, not pushing it too much, but normalizing it. Maybe it's a regular toolbox session or a chat. And I think, again, it goes back to culture and providing a safe environment where people won't feel like they're made fun of or they're seen to be weak. I think that's one of the main barriers at the moment.
Could I just add to that, based on some of the work we've been doing with young workers, and the focus of this piece of work we're doing is actually trying to improve communication and create a supportive environment within which young workers can be healthy and well and safe. And it's really interesting because we've had examples where some young workers who've been going through tough times and have sought help have actually been punished for it. So they've been given very menial, unpleasant jobs when they've come back from a period of time off, because they've done the wrong thing and their supervisors have been unhappy with that. So I think there's a lot to be said for educating leaders about the consequences of their actions and the way they interact with workers. Skills, emotional intelligence and being able to demonstrate empathy, being a good listener, being not judgmental, making sure you respect people's personal boundaries and don't pry and respect people's privacy. These are all things that we can actually give people the skills to do these better. And they're not traditionally skills that people are taught in their formal, technical construction education or training. But they're critically important. So again, that's something that I think is an area where things could be done differently.
And I think, Helen, that goes back to this issue we've been talking about, the absolute importance of supervisor support, both emotionally and practically.
Great response, guys. This question comes from a good friend of the podcast, Adam Nebbs, out of Tasmania. Given the competitive nature of the construction industry, could anything be done in the tenders process to ensure those bidding are making psych health and safety a priority? Amanda, maybe you've got you've been a bit tough, is it?
I feel like he's like, ask the question that's on my mind every day. Absolutely. That's probably what I would say would be the number one thing that I think needs to change. Coming back to my comment before about people, wanting that they do genuinely care, but they also, are afraid sometimes to take action or do things that may put them out of that tendering process. And a lot of leaders that I've talked to in other companies, will say that they're actually wanting their clients to put in greater stringent requirements around psychological health and safety so that they can do what they want to do and improve, but also they're on a level playing field across all builders and construction companies. So again, I know there's some work going on in that space with the group we talked about before, but I think that needs to be right across the board, again, with those private clients and others as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a very similar question come up from another person on the YouTube channel. Projects are often won or lost on program and costs, both of which impact directly on project teams, subcontractors, and resourcing. How do we get industry to work together to reach better outcomes? So it seems to be a topical thing. Like Amanda, you say it's top of mind for you most days. Helen and Michelle, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just really jump in before Helen does. I'll just going back to the client and the contract. We know that those if the organisation doesn't hit its contracted completion date, there'll be a daily financial penalty, which is quite big, and that also really pushes people working really hard to get the job done, so the organisation is not penalised. But going back to what Amanda said, they had to put it into the tender the way they did so they could get the job. So it's a vicious circle.
And just to add to that, I think it's interesting to recognise that in the last 10, 20 years, construction clients have done an awful lot to drive change in the workplace safety and the occupational health space. And this may be the next progression from that there are things that clients can do to drive change. But I think it's absolutely right to say that no single organization can fix this problem itself, because it is a systemic issue. It goes to the way projects are costed and won and lost in a competitive tendering process. And it's really important that a collaborative approach be taken. And that's why the initiative I mentioned, the Construction Industry Culture Task Force, which involves government, New South Wales and Victorian government organisations, and the Australian Constructors Association and others, all working together to try and change the industry's culture with a view to improving working time, health and well-being, and gender diversity is actually such an important initiative.
Yeah, and I guess given in Australia in particular, right, given this is going to be the focus of new regulations next year, you'd have to say, like, it's part of the procurement process that you look at your subcontractors and do they actually have a process for identifying and managing psychosocial risks? Is that something that you see would work practically, Amanda?
Yeah, I think I noticed a comment from Mark about ESG, and that's probably not an area that health and safety practitioners and even broader than that are fully aware of, but there's certainly a lot more emphasis these days from investors about that more holistic well-being of people, not just people that work within the organisation. So I think if knowing, what your clients and the industry that you're working in, what their drivers are, understanding that a little bit more and tapping into that is probably something that could be helpful as well.
Yeah. Speaking of ESG, actually, we've got another friend of the podcast who asked a question, probably one of the most vocal people around ESG in Australia, Wade Needham. He asks the question, is it ethical to use pre-employment medicals to screen out those predisposed to psychological health and safety hazards if they can't be controlled by an organisation? So first of all, I would have to say to Wade, I'd like to see some evidence that the company has actually tried to control the psychosocial hazards before thinking they need to screen out people who are just weak or are likely to develop an illness, if you like, as is often perceived, I guess, by the industry. But I've got 3 subject matter experts here that probably can answer this question better than what I can. So maybe I see Michelle wanting to weigh in, I think, on this one.
I'll just jump in and talk to some of our physical pain, mental health research. We talked about that briefly before, but in the research, it showed that all manual construction workers expect to experience pain at some point in their career. And, of concern was that all of the manual workers in their 20s experience some form of pain every day. And I think that's probably beyond their control, but it also impacts on their physical and mental health. So when it's the nature of your job, it's hard to make changes to, I think.
Yeah. Anything else to add to that, Amanda?
Just kind of in line with your comment, and Wade's going to probably kill us for not answering directly, but I would like to see as well. I know that there's a lot of research on. Now I might not get this term right. You could probably correct me, Jason, but is that the 5 dark traits, so narcissism and others that contribute to things like bullying and harassment and things like that. I know that some companies screen for those sort of things, but again, that's not common practice.
Yeah, and I've heard maybe from Beck McCulloch before regarding sexual harassment and trying to screen out people based on some of those traits, as you say. Yeah, so maybe the same. But I think what Wade's talking about here in particular are people who maybe have had a previous mental illness, for example, because we know that they're more likely to have a reoccurrence than people who've never had a mental illness in their lifetime, for example. So ethically, I don't necessarily think that's the right way to go. Like any other injury, right, you make accommodations if the person's qualified and can do the job that you're asking them to do. But I still haven't seen enough evidence that employers are actually dealing with psych health and safety hazards appropriately. They've got to do that first. And then maybe if they can't eliminate all hazards, then or reduce them to as low as reasonably practicable, then they need to look at screening people out. And I know it definitely happens with first responders, like police and fire, for example. They're subject to psychological interviews, and they look at illness indicators as well. Given they're expected to experience trauma as part of the role, and that obviously is part of the role. You can't, unfortunately, eliminate that as a hazard from these roles. You might be able to reduce the exposure or the frequency or duration of exposure, but definitely it's expected that they will experience that at some point. But I think it's a tough question from Wade deliberately. I don't think there's an easy answer to it. Maybe we can ask. I think Joelle is chairing the session that Wade's going to be on in a couple of days for the AIHS conference. Maybe she can throw that one at him and see if he can answer it any better. One question is an interesting one that's come up. Any data on uptake of EAP support in the construction industry? So for listeners who aren't aware, or in countries that maybe this is less common, EAP is an employee assistance program. So counselling support, reactive support for people who do experience distress, whether that's work-related or home-related. So is there any data on the uptake specific to the construction industry, ladies?
I could talk to my understanding, and just from what I've seen, is that it's not dissimilar to other industries. And some people, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know, that the uptake of EAP is actually really low. There is some research that I've seen where they've looked at the types of support. This is from the Change Lab, again from an amazing team of positive psychologists that looked at workplace wellbeing, and they looked at the types of support that people are most likely to reach out for, and EAP was the lowest, is somewhere around 8%. So I know you've spoken about this a lot, Jason. So you really doing your people a disservice if you're relying on that as the main primary source of your sort of mental health or psych health and safety strategy. I will say though that, like I said earlier, it's definitely not an or discussion. Like, do all of that and don't even worry about EAP. I know someone personally, again, a road worker I used to work with, and EAP saved his life. He was going to commit suicide and didn't, because he was able to speak to a psychologist through that free service. So I think it has its place, but if you're relying on that, which we know a lot of companies do, and they sort of promote it all over the place and spend all this time and effort on it, that with mental health first aid, then I think, yeah, there's a real challenge for them.
Yeah, no, we definitely subscribe to the integrated model of workplace mental health. So that's around mitigating illness, preventing harm, and promoting the positive. And so understanding that mental health is a continuum, and that, you know, in a large enough organization, you're going to have employees at all different levels of that continuum, ranging from illness to flourishing. You do really need a range of initiatives to kind of meet people where they're at. And like you say, EAP can be very useful for people when they need it. But if your only response is EAP to workplace mental health, then you're really not preventing people from getting to that point of needing an EAP in the first place. So we know that any money spent upstream, you know, can have much more benefit downstream than just focusing on the downstream. So it'd be great to see organizations, you know, use maybe some of the preventing harm and promoting the positive part of that integrated model, and relying less on things like peer support, mental health first aid, and EAP as their first port of call when it comes to employee mental health. Well, I think that gets us through the majority of the question, everyone. I think that's really good for timing as well, because I think there's just a few minutes to go. Is there any comments that, and I might go around the room here, any final comments about what your hopes are for the future of workplace mental health in the construction industry, maybe starting with you, Helen? Oh, I believe you're on mute.
I'm very heartened that there does seem to be a broader systems view being taken of the challenges. I think some of the challenges are really deep rooted. They've been around for a long time. They're very entrenched. It's very hard to change these things, but I think the conversations are now addressing some of those really, you know, deeply entrenched practices that are associated with the system and the business model that the industry's for a very long time worked to. So I am very optimistic. The only other thing I would say is that in our studies of burnout in construction, burnout's generally regarded as a syndrome that has three components: emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and diminished sense of professional efficacy. What's really interesting to me is in the construction industry, people are very emotionally exhausted. Our research clearly shows that. But their sense of professional efficacy is still very positive. And that tells me that we have a really fantastic industry that people really like to work in. So if we can actually fix some of these endemic problems, then I think we'll see a really productive and fabulous industry. So that's an interesting insight, because that's quite different to what we see manifesting in terms of burnout in other sectors.
Yeah, no, they're very interesting thoughts there. Michelle.
Just echoing the importance of that structural change and the systems perspective, and it's great to see that you know, clients, or, you know, government organisations, unions, organisations, peak bodies are starting to talk about this together and approach this together. I think that's what's needed. But I also think it's important in terms of the culture, you know, to remove expectations that people work a 60+ hour week. It keeps women out of the industry. It prevents workers from being able to recover, to enjoy time outside of work and participate in healthy lifestyles and do the things that they'd like to do outside of work. And I'll also echo that, you know, most of the folks that we talk to are really passionate about the industry. They love buildings, they love construction. Thank you.
Yeah, terrific. Amanda.
Yeah, it was amazing to hear some of those reflections from Helen and Michelle. And personally, I would echo that myself. I, you know, love working in this industry, and I think that we are on a much better track, considering, you know, more industry groups, more focused by governments, you know, starting to see some changes to agreements and things like that. So I think, you know, if we can keep heading in that direction, probably just speed it up a little bit. You know, I would also love to see more, and again, this does happen a little bit, but probably not enough. You quite often hear when you're in a working group around something to do with physical safety risks, about there being, you know, no IP in safety. And I would love to see that reflected for psychological health and safety, and for companies to share what they're doing. I've got a fantastic group of people that I talk to and learn from, and we're not always going to get it right, and we're going to try things that didn't work so well, but the most important thing is to try and to share that learning, and so that we can all sort of grow together, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great thought, and definitely we're seeing groups like the Corporate Mental Health Alliance here in Australia really doing a lot of sharing of good initiatives that they're doing. Like you say, sharing IP freely, things that may have been seen as a competitive advantage around people performance and whatnot, but going, well, morally, we have a right to share things that are working and are keeping people safe. So it'd be great to see more of that, particularly in construction, as these learnings come out. And great to see, Michelle and Helen doing so much research in this that is becoming, more and more available and really pointing in the right direction. So, ladies, thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this panel. You've done an amazing job really highlighting some of the main issues, and also maybe some of the way forwards in protecting work and mental health in the construction industry, particularly with a focus on the work. So thank you very much for your participation. But listeners, that brings us to the end of the webinar today. Just to let you know that this will be available immediately, or as soon as YouTube can upload it, following the completion of the live. So you'll be able to find that on the Flourish DX YouTube channel following this event. We're also going to release it Tuesday next week as a special Psych Health and Safety podcast episode. So if you prefer to consume these things as a podcast rather than watching it as a webinar or a video, you can wait till Tuesday next week and it'll be available then. The next live panel won't take place until sometime next year. We haven't even started thinking yet about what that could be. So it may be February, it may be March, but make sure you join up to the Flourish DX community available from the www.flourishdx.com page if you want to get early updates regarding the next panels that we'll be running. But that brings us to the end. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for your terrific questions, and we will catch you next time. Thanks.